Perfect. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well wherever you are for this panel. Today, the panel topic is confronting systemic racism in housing and education. Most of our panelists are here. We're still waiting on one more person, but I want to go ahead and get started in the sake of time, since we need to, there's a hard stop in an hour and 15 minutes. So I've allocated about 10 minutes per presentation. I'll, in the chat, let you know when there's like 1 minute left. And then I'll let my timer go off at like the 10-minute mark. So to let you know when to wrap up. So Timothy, you said you may need to leave early, might get disconnected at some point, but we're opposed to going first. I'll let you decide the order. I mean, I was gonna go in the order of the program, but you're last on the program, so maybe you want to go earlier.
Earlier is good, first is not so good.
Okay, we'll let you go, I guess, second then. How's that? Okay, on the program we have Dr. James Jennings first. Do you have control to be able to do your presentation? I think you have one.
Let me share my screen.
Okay.
And first of all, thank you for letting me be part of this panel, and nice meeting everyone virtually, and hope everyone is well. So let me see if I can share my slide presentation. And I say, let me see, because I'm still a little bit nervous about this new technology. Can you see this?
Yes.
Whoa, I feel good then. All right, it's weird looking at this. Let me see if I could make it a little bit smaller and move it over. Okay, again, I look forward to the discussion. And I'm Professor Emeritus at Tufts University. And the title of my presentation is Fair Housing and Zoning as Anti-Gentrification, the Case of Boston. Do you see all the lettering? Because okay, as long as you see all the lettering. So the paper's objective is to, I'm basically proposing that a full implementation of the Fair Housing Act 1968 can be leveraged as a tool in anti-gentrification struggles in urban areas. And I say this based on my work in Boston and being involved with the assessment of fair housing that's been taking place for the last 3 years, really. And the key to this argument has to do with the intersectionality of fair housing. It serves as a buffer against contributing factors that do lead to gentrification, including resident and business displacement. I have to say that this is also very important, a story of sustained community organizing. I think we realized a victory in the city of Boston around fair housing and making sure that it's approached broadly, interconnected, intersectional, but this had a lot to do with just really community organizing across neighborhoods and for a sustained period of time. So what do I mean by intersectionality? Actually, intersectionality is part of the law. When you look at judicial decisions, when you look at HUD regulations over the years, the intersectionality of fair housing has always been there, but it hasn't really been adhered to. Of course, under the Trump administration, this was a major threat and it was weakened. We may see a counter swing to that with the new administration, with the Biden administration. But the point that I'm making here is that if we're going to really do fair housing, we have to look at some of these issues that also reflect inequities and inequalities: transportation, employment, education, land use planning, environmental justice, poverty, health, in addition to access to housing. And again, these are, I could really list a lot of judicial decisions that have supported this approach to fair housing, not that it has been adhered to, as I just mentioned. So my role with this topic was basically as a member of what we call the AFHA Community Advisory Committee. And this is a committee of housing activists, civil rights activists, community activists, more or less about 15, 16 people. And we've been meeting consistently over the last 3-4 years, also working with the city agencies like the Boston Housing Authority, the Department of Neighborhood Development. Very importantly, CAC played a major role in organizing public testimony across the city. We went to most neighborhoods and we made the hearings very resident friendly and got a lot of information from community groups and residents. I, in particular, was responsible for collecting and analyzing a whole range of HUD, census, and administrative data. So this assessment was driven by two key questions. One is, what are the impediments to affirmatively furthering fair housing in Boston? And what goals should be adopted in response to the identified impediments and barriers? One of the issues that we ran into early with the city, as I said, we worked with the city was approaching fair housing as bricks and mortars. Simply as long as we don't discriminate in the area of housing, we're doing fair housing. And what community groups did under the CAC and a lot of organizations was to argue, no, we have to look at inequality. We have to look at racial and spatial inequality and respond to what makes things unequal and equitable, because if we don't, we're not really abiding by fair housing regulations. And so as we pulled the data together and we brought people together across silos, there were community-based organizations that were involved in any number of these areas, but were not really talking to each other. What we found out is that fair housing sort of became a glue in bringing people together and organizations together because of its intersectionality. And so you have people involved with the environmental justice movement in Boston, advocating for elderly services, people with concerned about language barriers as a sustenance of inequality. These organizations actually came together again in a number of forums, and this is what really provided a victory, which is not complete yet, but I think an important victory. And I think I want to talk a little bit about zoning. That's why I bolded this. In years past, we had a lot of good fair housing laws on the books, but really with no teeth. And we came to understand in Boston that the teeth for fair housing in Boston is zoning regulations, because zoning regulations determine designs, the number of buildings going up, the kinds of buildings, who can have access to these buildings, how much leeway do private developers have in organizing around public land, the use of public land. So these are just bullets of areas that we touched upon in our assessment of fair housing. Now, we also at some point, we also realized that this intersectionality is also exposing the faces, or you could say the components, of gentrification in Boston. This is an issue that was continually raised across the city. And in Boston, one of the things I've argued over the years is that when we think about gentrification, we have to look at city local conditions to really understand how it's being manifested. And in Boston, these are just components of how we have experienced gentrification. The gentrification as a low income and working class civic subsidy for wealthier newcomers. I won't talk about all of these bullets, but just to explain this first one, we have a history in Boston of community activists trying to improve the quality of life in their communities, Black, Latinx, and Asian people, who for years have struggled for better transportation, better health, cleaner streets. And as we win some of these fights, the value of land goes up. And in these same places, it's these same places where you have white, wealthier people coming in, it's almost as if they're earning something on the backs of low income and working class people who have been struggling for better communities for a while. The other thing that I have to emphasize is that in Boston, gentrification is very racialized. And I have to say this because initially with our discussions and debates with the city, the racialization of gentrification was actually left off the table. We we're able to bring them around because of community advocacy and organizing, but we cannot speak of gentrification or how to respond to it, at least in Boston, if we don't acknowledge that there's an entrenched racial hierarchy. Boston is still one of the most segregated cities in the nation. The other bullet, just to illustrate this, the bullet on the bottom here, severe housing costs. This is also a facet of gentrification. And so what I did, I generated this map showing the city of Boston by census tracts and neighborhoods, and highlighting the dark colors, those tracts and parts of neighborhoods where one third or more of all the households in those tracts pay 50% or more of their income for rent. This is considered a severe cost burden. Now, after I did that, I looked at the distribution of the Black and Latinx population, and as you can see, the red dots represent Black concentration, yellow Latinx representation. You can see that these two groups tend to reside in those very same areas where we have the again the highest levels, the highest number of households facing severe cost burdens. So we had, we developed 14 goals, and these goals have been adopted by the city. And we're now, because our mayor may be the new Secretary of Labor, US Labor, we're sort of trying to figure out, does Marty Walsh sign the executive order, or the first Black woman mayor in Boston, Kim Jennings, signed the executive order? But this is really ready to go. I'm going to end my presentation by, again, coming back to zoning, because zoning, having fair housing language incorporated into our zoning codes is a major victory. The zoning codes in Boston really emerged 1956, Charter of 1956, fair housing, of course, 1968. These are really two different narratives. And as long as these narratives were separated, we could say anything we want about fair housing and how to push it, but it was the zoning board and the BRA, what people used to know as the Boston Redevelopment Authority, that decided how Boston is going to look physically, and without at all considering questions or problems associated with fair housing. And so here are two, and by the way, Lydia Edwards is a city councilor from East Boston, primarily Latinx, who led the charge in insisting that our zoning regulations now include fair housing. And so these are just two sites. This is the mayor's press conference, and this is a link to a Shelter Force article that was recently published about this major victory in Boston. And so very briefly, my last slide, what does this mean? And why do we think that this can generate some more momentum for progressive change in Boston? What this means is that developers must now, and again, I emphasize, for the first time in Boston's history, design proposals, development proposals with measurable fair housing assessments. Developers did not have to do this up until March 15, 2021. And this is very summary. The amendment shows more complexity than this, but this is just very summary. This means that developers must now ask and fill out a process, complete a process, which answers what might happen to longtime residents based on what you, developer, are proposing. Are the proposed housing units reflective of household or family size in surrounding communities? So if you have a community like East Boston, where the average family size might be 3, 4, but a developer is only proposing building units that accommodate a 1.2 person family or 1 person household, then there's a problem with that. What is happening to our small businesses? How are they being impacted? And can developers do something that will respond to this? So developers are required now to comply with this assessment. And there are any number of ways. Again, this is very summary, but one way might mean to build more affordable units based on local median house income, not the area median household income, not HUD's area median outcome, but the local median house income in the neighborhood. You have a neighborhood like Roxbury, for example, Mattapan, where the median income is way lower than the area median income. So to say, define affordability, we have to define affordability in a way that doesn't disadvantage people who are more low income and more working class. Some people might want to increase, we require developers to pay fees into certain trusts for jobs and to build more housing. Some developers might say, well, the way I'm going to respond to this fair housing is to, a requirement is to increase my fees. The point here is that this has to happen before developer proposals are approved. Let me leave it there and just say that this is just the start. We think it's an important victory, but it's just the start because we're already, debating with the city, how many people should be on the monitoring agency that's going to be appointed, which big time developments are part of this or not. We started with all big time developments. We call them Article 80 in Boston, but all large developments are part of this. Some people in the city say, well, that's not really what the amendment says. So we're now getting into the devil's in the details. But again, I think we have a foundation to move the city forward. And if I could also say that the next mayor, Kim Janey, she's been a strong anti-gentrification advocate as a city council person and as a community advocate. So we're really hopeful that this momentum is going to continue. But again, the T's have to be crossed and the I's have to be dotted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting and important project. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Next, we have Timothy. And again, I'm going to try to keep us on time since we also have a good number of people who showed up to the panel. And I want to make sure we leave room for Q&A.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Timothy Lewis. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville. Today, I'm going to talk about racism, racism at predominantly white institutions and how their pronouncements and statements, particularly in the recent most quote unquote racial awakening, have actually created a structure that will sustain racism. So when I do research, I don't start with my research question. I think that's a biased way to start. I start with an observation or set of observations. I think that leads to inductive reasoning because you follow the observations through and then you let the data tell the story. So the first observation is that anti-racism and these responses to racism now seem to be really popular. Everybody has a director of D&I or an associate dean of D&I or a vice chancellor of diversity. So it's really popular. When you look at what people believe is the source of continued racism in the United States, that's where we see a difference along racial lines. Most white Americans believe that racism is sustained because you have a few bad apples. There are individuals who are racist, whereas African Americans and other racial minorities tend to lean towards the notion that there are racist structures, that are racist institutions, policies perpetuate disadvantage. And so when you look just at data from the most recent General Social Survey, what you see is that white people are much less likely to favor an institutional solution of increasing funding to racism than African Americans are. Less than half of whites and 8 in 10 African Americans are willing to increase fundings. But specifically when we look in higher education, what we see is that white faculty still tend to prioritize this individualist approach, that there are racist individuals and not the institution itself is racist. So at a racial equity academy at a university, observations led us to see that white people were more likely to support what we call implicit bias training. And that's what I call white people's acceptable racism. They say implicit bias because everybody has bias. I don't think everyone has racial bias, just everyone has bias, but implicit bias covers a range of identities. More importantly, they are less likely to really push towards systemic solutions like mandatory training and mandatory quotas for diversity hires, things of that nature. The thing is, implicit bias is an individual or interpersonal manifestation of racism, according to Dr. Leanne Bell. Whereas anti-racism, which is what these places are claiming, is really about looking at the institutions, the structures, the systems, and the policies. So those observations then led me to my research question and that is, why do institutions in higher education, particularly predominantly white institutions, release all these anti-racism statements that announce all these values, yet they fail to change the actual policies and the structures which are at the center of racism? And do these pronouncements or these statements that are really about egalitarianism or equality, do they really sustain racism perpetually? And my theory is that these statements and announcements at predominantly white institutions, what they do is they create a structure that leads to an anti-Black campus. And so I'm basing this on the Video and Gardner's study of aversive racism. And I'm going to explain that in a minute, but it is important to note that they say that aversive racism characterizes the racial attitudes of most well-educated white liberals, the people that make up the predominantly white institutions, particularly on the faculty side. So there are three pillars to, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. There are three pillars to aversive racism, according to DeVito and Gardner. The first one is that white people have a non-prejudicial self-view, which means that I'm not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I'm not racist. I have Black friends. There's this they don't see themselves as inherently racist. They don't even see themselves sometimes as being beneficiaries of white privilege. And they see themselves this way because they support egalitarian policies that apply the same standard to everyone. And they don't support reparative policies or remedial policies where you're trying to remedy the disadvantage faced by some group. They just support applying the same standard to everyone, while holding negative views about people of color. In the Video and Gardner study, they particularly look at how this disadvantages Black candidates who are trying to get tenure-line faculty appointments. So this little quote here is from the actual paper. It says, under this form of racism, whites believe themselves not to be racist. Through the explicit support of egalitarian principles, yet hold negative perceptions or racial resentment about minorities. And what I am saying is that when universities release these statements, they take this individual form of racism and they actually make it an entire structure that characterizes the entire institution, because the institution now has a non-prejudicial view of itself. When you look at the pronouncements and statements that these predominantly white institutions are making, they never say that the institution is racist. They never say they are racist policies. They never even blame the culture. It's always some blame on society and they're responding to society. And then these statements, these pronouncements always evoke values of equality and never really focus on justice or equity. And because of that, these persons that hold the negative views, the faculty, the staff, these people are insulated because now they point to the university values as justification for their apply everybody the same standard type of approach. And what this does is this creates an anti-Black environment in the university. So my hypothesis is that when predominantly white institutions pursue these anti-racism efforts that affirm a non-prejudicial white institutional view and they prioritize equality in these statements and whatever, the post-statement atmosphere of the campus will be an anti-Black climate. So what I did was, I took Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, which is the university I work at, in a predominantly white university, Illinois, and I did a case study of it. What the university did was they made every announcement or pronouncement about anti-racism since May 29th public, and it's available on their anti-racism website. So I consider those my inputs. I'm doing an input outcome assessment. So there were 17 statements made between June the 1st and of last year and February 1st of this year. I go through each statement line by line, doing what's called a de novo review, which means I let the narrative tell itself rather than trying to infuse my own opinion into the narrative. And I look for 5 themes throughout these statements. A theme of diversity, inclusion, equity, equality, and social justice. So I'm not just looking just for the words. I'm even looking for a theme where if someone says, well, we want to be we've acknowledged injustice, I'm considered that a theme of social justice. And then at the beginning of this year, the Black Faculty and Staff Association did a climate survey. So the climate survey is actually like a post-assessment of all these statements that have been made for the past 6 or 7 months. And so quickly, here are some of my findings. First, what I find is that the university's default position is diversity and inclusion. And diversity and inclusion are really manifestations of equality. When you talk about diversity, you're saying having representation equal to that of society. And when we talk about inclusion, you're talking about having equal access to participate. So this graph is kind of rickety, but it shows you what values were prioritized in these statements from May 29th all the way up to January the 1st of this year. And what you'll see is that before the George Floyd incidents really took off, the university prioritized inclusion. It did not prioritize equity until the things this summer happened. That's not their default position. That's their position in response to societal matters. And then you'll note that from this period of time, there were no statements. So that's the first thing. Their default position is not equity, it's not social justice, it's diversity and inclusion. The university has a non-prejudicial self-view. When you go through line by line, the university will never admit that they themselves are racist, that their policies are racist, that their culture is racist. At best, what they would do is say, well, we haven't responded quickly enough to the racism that is in society. And then looking at the post-climate, so the climate of the campus post all of these pronouncements and supposed policy initiatives. 76% of Black faculty still said that the campus climate was tense. And so I took that factor, I ran it linear regression along 7 other factors dealing with university perceptions. And what I found is that there's a statistically significant relationship between the interracial climate, the university, and their inability to recruit Black faculty. So what does this mean? First, the early pronouncements prioritize diversity and inclusion, not equity and social justice. Secondly, the announcement shows the university has a non-prejudicial self-view. And then lastly, the majority of Blacks feel that the campus climate is still tense. And then when you assess factors, they perceive that the aversive racism in the roles of deans and chairs have prevented the hiring of Black faculty. Basically, the implications of these findings is that anti-racism probes and affirming these egalitarian values at PWIs without policy change is only a retrofit of aversive racism. You're only modifying it. This retrofitting allows the institutions and the members to claim allyship because they prioritize equality while simultaneously betraying the tenets of anti-racism. So they're anti-racist in their statements, but they're not in their substance. And that completes my presentation. And there are just some other publications that I have out if you want to follow my work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Isabelle Soyfer.
Probably mute myself. I'm Isabelle Soyfer. I'm a 3rd-year PhD student. A little intimidated by all the professors, but it's okay. Thank you so much for allowing me on this panel. I'm gonna go ahead and start. So my paper is mostly based on research I did in my master's that I intend to continue for my dissertation. So this is just based on kind of preliminary findings. So the title is Knowledge Economy Incarnate Gentrification in New York City Neighborhood. And this is kind of the part of the neighborhood that's been cut out for Columbia University, which I was a student I was one of their students. At one of the assembly meetings I went to, November 2015, I attended these for a year. They're monthly, and one of the first people I heard speak in these assembly meetings was elementary school principal Reginald Higgins, and he spoke about how the housing conditions were affecting the children at Grant Houses. It's a housing development basically right across the street from Columbia University. So he said, how are the kids supposed to go to sleep at night if they are without heat, uncomfortable, pain is being transferred elsewhere, kids are looking to the adults for help. And I heard another resident talk about how the heaters in their apartment weren't fixed. You know, it's getting a lot colder, November turning into December, and the repair requests she sent a month prior were not fulfilled. And the president of the Residents Association, Carlton Davis, he's pictured here, he talked about how the residents need to submit these forms in bulk and that help from the outside wasn't needed. He continued, there's a plan and a purpose to what takes place here, and there's always a relationship with what happens out there. They will challenge your right to your community. We're not invisible and we won't give up our power. He then asked where are all the young guys to step up and become active. So President Davis wanted to raise up young men as leaders to amplify the voices of all residents and gain a space at the negotiating table of neighborhood politics, which included Columbia University's recent Manhattanville expansion and their proposed youth programming. Here's several different views of the neighborhood. One thing I always find interesting is how they label different parts, and it seems like West Harlem is always getting smaller. And so I explore Grant Houses as a contested terrain. So various residents had different opinions about what should be done to help young people. So while a lot of residents were really concerned about getting, responses to the broken infrastructure just so they can live more comfortably and safely, President Davis focused more on a masculinist youth programming to meet the community needs, which is largely reflective of youth programming that's kind of been talked about a lot ever since at least about the 1950s by various institutions in the neighborhood. So in a political context where Columbia is seeking to become the primary decision-making authority, there are competing visions and timelines, and I believe that reveals how gentrification operates. And it also shows that there's a competition over problem definition. So no one can even agree what the problem is, which makes it even easier for Columbia to create lasting harm in West Harlem. So as a university with a mission to benefit the public, they have a not-for-profit status. They still represent themselves as a partner of Grant Houses, but even as Columbia proposes programming to incorporate youth residents of Grant, young residents into higher education's fold, they also criminalize them. In this case, it was with an NYPD raid that happened, I'd say shortly before they started construction of the expansion. So Columbia worked with the city to police the neighborhood and create what I call like a physical embodiment of the knowledge economy. What I mean by police the neighborhood is that as education scholar Sabina Vout terms removal, so it's the seizing of young people of color from the private spheres of their homes. And by knowledge economy, I'm talking about a knowledge-intensive activities that contribute to an accelerated pace of technical and scientific advance. So the central question that I was looking at became, how did Columbia's quote unquote disconnected youth, as termed by Columbia, how did that narrative justify disinvestment in and even theft from the communities their programs were supposedly serving? And how did they ignore the structural issues that were important to young people? And how did this expansion fit within the global white spatial imaginary? So I drew a lot from political scientists, urban planners who have written about how we need to recognize that political practice by public housing residents is just as political as any other realm of politics, and just as important, and that ethnographic methods can be very useful to see how residents are experiencing and perceiving how the neighborhood is changing, and how effective they view these Grant General Assembly meetings. And I largely based my work on Stuart Hall's text, Policing the Crisis, where he writes of the moment of the mugger in Britain. So is this falsehood that initiated harsh new forms of racialized policing in Britain based on how racial minorities were positioned within the social formation. And I also draw from George Lipshitz's white social imaginary theory, the unfair gains and unjust enrichments primarily available to whites that have created undeserved impediments to upward mobility for communities of color. So Columbia accepted Robert Moses's post-World War II white supremacist urban renewal approach. So urban renewal was basically the physical reordering of the city to combat what they called blight in the physical plane, and also to interrupt what Moses viewed as the moral blight in young people. And this narrative echoed what a lot of 19th century eugenicists in European and American cities and in white dominated cities across the colonized world perpetuated. So they saw this as a way to alleviate racial mixing and justify whites only housing. They saw, rather than ever actually addressing the problem of unavailability of high quality housing stock for migrants moving into the city. And so they would condemn racialized neighborhoods as blighted. And this aided and abetted the building of whites only suburbs and freeway transit infrastructure projects. So here I showed just several documents that I found in Columbia's archives depicting, who they perceive as being the idealized citizen in their Manhattanville housing brochure. New York Times was all over this, writing about how dangerous the neighborhood was, just propagating all these harmful narratives that would kind of further justify urban renewal. So here are the sort of sketches of the Manhattanville expansion. It's since progressed a lot more since I was there. Originally started out looking like what you see here. So in 2003 was when Columbia announced this Manhattanville expansion, which they claimed it would serve the public good by, people working there would research the cure for Alzheimer's disease and also help usher in the city into a knowledge-based economic future. And they signed a community benefits agreement with residents at Grand Manhattanville houses. But as activists called out, the CBA negotiations were actually quite rigged, and there was no structure in place to enforce its terms. So I did interview one Manhattanville resident. He talked about how there were supposed to be a lot more scholarships given to young people in the neighborhood than there actually were, like way less. And a lot of residents didn't even really know about the resources that were available. So of course then, activists' words proved true because of an exceedingly harsh policing of the very same young people that Columbia's programs promised to provide guidance and care for. So like a few months before the expansion was constructed, they arrested 40 young people who were suspected to be gang members based on internet surveillance. And as one father of an arrested young person said, the residents asked for help from Columbia for many years, and yet all they got was a raid. Sorry, I'll try to speed this up. So I did interview, apologies. So I did interview Flores Alexander Forbes. He's actually a former Black Panther member and has been an urban planner in Harlem for 25 years and now works for Columbia University. And he talked about how the Opportunity Youth Program would be helpful to bringing in more young people to Columbia's, to fulfill Columbia's commitment to helping the community. But then when I asked him about the police raids, he didn't see how Columbia could be responsible or involved in any way. And then like maybe a day after the raids, this statement was released claiming that the raids would make the neighborhood safer for everyone and enhanced police presence would be better. But this made me wonder, which community is actually being made safer? And when I reached out to him to ask that, basically ask that, he said that they don't have interactions with residents. Yet when I look at other universities like University of Chicago or Northwestern University, students have documented how a lot of arrests made by universities, private police forces have actually been of unaffiliated residents, many of whom are Black. So to conclude, this was my ultimate conclusion for what I've found so far, So Columbia claims to want to help the community work with the community and pursue the greater good, and yet the greater good doesn't appear to actually include Grant residents, and especially the young people who they claim to be helping. So according to residents, gentrification and the raid were emblematic of Columbia's seemingly offhand approach, even as they directly affected residents' safety and security. Columbia's actions serve to protect the white ethnic imagined community from the imaginary threat posed by what seemed to challenge it the most. The Black spatial imaginary of Grant residents, particularly of the young people living there, the bearers of the neighborhood's future. So yes, that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And then now we have the last one by Stephanie Jones.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for everyone coming to the panel. And thank you to all the other panelists who presented before me. They were all so great. So I want to start my presentation just going through sort of a story. As a warning, my sort of argument here is really heavy on theory and heavy on just sort of like a theoretical argument. And I know that when we start to throw around the word gentrification, there's lots of ideas that we have around what it means for us, what we've seen in our cities, how activists use the word gentrification. But a lot of my like big beef with the term gentrification and the theory of gentrification comes through sort of the more theoretical side. So I want to start off in World War II London. This is actually where the theory of gentrification comes from. Ruth Glass sort of wrote this essay describing how this middle-class neighborhood in London after World War II was sort of taken over by wealthier newcomers, as she describes them. And sort of what we gain from Ruth Glass's theory is this understanding that urban spaces and neighborhood change has a sort of unit of analysis all in its own, right? And when we look at what Ruth Glass is actually giving us in her essay, it's a lot about a story of we have singular neighborhoods that have knowledge bases, that have sort of like a spatial context. And that spatial context, whether we're talking about working class or what she sort of like titles as these middle class newcomers, once the changes occur, that knowledge about this place and this space also changes. So there are new producers of knowledge, or whether she sort of talks about it, there's sort of new residents that can take sort of stake in how we think about the value of each of these neighborhoods. So those are some of the things that we gain through Ruth Glass's theory. What we lose, however, and what becomes so obvious when you go back to her original theory is there's no understanding of what else is happening. So first of all, it's important to know that Ruth Glass is like a stark Marxian theorist, right? So she is literally taking Marx's analysis and saying, look, here are the things that are happening in London. Here's how we can see how Marx's work shows up for us here. And so for Ruth Glass, she's really looking at the sort of proletariat or the working class as one group. And what we miss are all of these other people that are in London at that time. And when she's looking at this proletarian group, she's sort of observing how these white British nationalist norms are being interrupted, because for her, the white British nationalist norms comes from the working class, comes from the sort of like proletarian group. And this middle class really sort of like tears that apart and sort of dociles the idea that the British nationalist context is coming from the working man. The other problem is that there's no room for the aristocracy in Ruth's theory. In Glass's theory. I'm calling her by her first name because I know her. So there's no room for the aristocracy. So when we think of these wealthier newcomers, for Ruth Glass, she's really talking about the middle class. She doesn't leave room for how the aristocracy is sort of like, are they there? Are they present? Are they not there? There's really no mention of them. Last but not least, we know because of world history that Britain was never a monolithic group, that Britain was never an all-white place. But the way Ruth Glass writes her theory, she's talking about a white proletarian group. When she does mention other folks, the conversation is usually around West Indian immigrants who are coming into the city, and sort of the tethering that West India has in terms of like the history of Britain, the history of London, right? And so a lot of what she talks about has a lot of roots in xenophobia and how these groups are coming in and again messing up this white proletarian middle class that represents the nationalist sort of context that she's looking through. So in the theory of gentrification, if we are to just really take Ruth Glass's word for it, we have to look at A, the proletariat as one group, B, the middle class as one group. We miss the aristocracy completely, or we miss sort of like, let's call them the one percenters, the big time people who are got the big money. We miss all of those folks. And we also miss how folks who are non-white proletarians are interacting with senses of value. Knowledge is about place, taking stakeholders in terms of this spatial analysis. We miss all of that. In 1996, Neil Smith comes along and sort of like really re-enters the conversation of gentrification. And a lot of the stuff that we learned from gentrification actually roots more in Neil Smith's theory, because he sort of like really goes hard in the Marxian analysis and really starts to try and help us understand how value gets changed based on the people who are in the space. But again, through Neil Smith's theory, because we are talking about this Marxian analysis, we lose all of the same components that we lose in Ruth Glass's theory. So in my project, I'm looking at Oakland, California, post-2008. And originally I went in with this idea that like, look, I'm about to tell you a story about gentrification. It's gonna be fly. I'm gonna sew this up in a bow and it's gonna be good. But when I went into Oakland, what I found was that people on the ground had a much more complex story about what was happening, particularly post-2008. Again, can't miss the aristocracy, because in Oakland in 2008, what's happening is you have all these big time companies. You've got Uber, you've got Google, you've got Amazon, who are all coming into San Francisco, all taking stakes in Oakland and really claiming some of the like knowledge space that's happening in terms of the production. You also have this sort of really intense story that the proletarian, if we're going to call them that, the working class, have a much different story to tell around how their housing is being removed or stripped from them. And third, and I think most importantly, the more you talk to people in Oakland, the more you see how what's happening in terms of fair housing policies becomes a really Black story. If we think about California, California is a new Black space. And what I mean by that is most of the people in California, myself included, are probably third, maybe fourth generation Californians. Because when we look at the Great Migration cycles, most of the people who are coming to California are coming through these sort of like wartime posts, because Oakland itself is a port city. So a lot of Black people that are coming into Oakland are coming through in that time. And when we see the result that happened after 2008, it literally devastates the Black community. So post 2008 context, the 2/3 of the wealth, the Black wealth that happens in Oakland gets removed. And it's literally just this period where the rug gets pulled out from under people. And when people are analogizing the situation, it's not a class-based story. It's not a proletarian story. It's a story of what's happening to the Black homeowner. Who is the Black homeowner? What are the protections that we have from the Black homeowners? It's also a really big story about Black residents. Where are Black residents allowed to be? Where are they allowed to exist? And again, what kind of protections do we have for them? In Oakland, post-2008, particularly in the period of 2010 to 2011, Black residents were twice as likely than the entire city of Oakland to be evicted from their housing. So we're seeing a story that, again, numerically is much more complicated. And when you talk to these Black residents, you have so much more of a story around the character of who is the Black resident in Oakland. Last but not least, I'm pulling through a racial capitalism analysis and really trying to understand what is it about racial capitalism that is really just wreaking havoc and sowing a lot of violence in this really specific moment around fair housing? It's important to note that California had plenty of opportunities to really put into law, put it down on paper, that we expect fair housing and we want the state to have teeth and really ensuring that that's happening. And multiple times, California has said no. The city of Oakland has in some ways attempted, based on the years and years of activism around fair housing. We can think through the Black Panther Party and beyond, of people trying to really understand what fair housing looked like. The problem is the theory of gentrification really leads us to talk about a class analysis. So let's break that down. When we think of low income housing in Oakland, California, the median income right now, low income is defined as $90,000. So $90,000 is really the measure for how we think about low income housing. And 60% of Black people make under $90,000, counting them as low income. But if your housing is $90,000, that means that your rent is allowable to be upwards of $2,100 a month, which most people can afford, and particularly most Black residents can afford. So again, even going through the schematic of how do we think about income as it impacts the residents in Oakland, that's not a really good measure. More importantly, people are very hesitant, particularly policymakers are very hesitant to say, we want protections for Black residents, because that would mean that we have to open the conversation that we do not have de facto segregation in Oakland, but rather we have a long history of policies that have resulted in the kinds of segregation that we see, which includes, but is not limited to, the kinds of laws that we have around surplus housing in California for the state and in Oakland more specifically. And a lot of what we think of as surplus land, surplus value is rooted in these racialized spatial knowledges that we have based in Oakland, California specifically, but also in California more broadly. So I'll end with this. A lot of the residents in California who I've talked to specifically in Oakland really cry out an emphasis that if we do not start thinking about how housing, space, and place are always going to be racialized, that the Black homeowner, the Black resident needs some kind of protection and specific protections from the state. If we lose that in our analysis as scholars, if we lose that in our analysis as activists, we really are going to be missing the mark in terms of what we need to do to protect Black residents. This is why I want to move away from this theory of gentrification. And I'm really trying to open up a new framework. I've considered sort of ideas around apartheid. I've considered ideas around really something around anti-gentrification theories. And I'm working on a model, haven't had one stick since. So I'd love to hear some ideas on that. But I think that the model of gentrification really leads us away from the actual problem. And it leads us away from a racial analysis that people on the ground have really been hitting hard and really been trying to detail their own ideas about the problems that's happening in Oakland. So thank y'all for your time. I hope to get lots of questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for your really great presentations and the really great research that you're working on. I'm going to try to be brief on my comments so that we can get to the Q&A, because I'd really like to give people opportunity to ask more questions. And I know even in the exchanges of papers among the panelists, there was a lot of engagement that I want to actually allow to happen in this virtual space, since we can't walk with each other to the next conference, to the next panel. All right, so first, I want to congratulate all of these papers for really trying to understand and complicate our understandings of racism and how we should be addressing systemic racism. The first paper, Dr. Jennings talks about challenging gentrification as a way of living up to what the Fair Housing Act said it was trying to live up to, right? And by looking at this one particular instance of it in Boston and with the CAC. And I really like how you are highlighting this community-centered practice in order to confront systemic racism. I think a lot of our research is moving more in that direction, becoming more mainstream and moving in that direction. And I like that you're focusing in that area by centering the people who are affected by the issues to help reach solutions to make sure that those solutions are actually addressing real problems instead of providing symbolic ways to address them, right? I also think you do an amazing job of discussing the implications, the understandings of what gentrification is, and connecting it to the Fair Housing Act and how it can actually lead to more, to better policies. In terms of areas of improvement, I think you do a better job in the presentation than you do in the paper of actually clarifying your research questions. I think it gets lost in some of the deeper discussions of each of the actors. And so it took a while for me to actually identify the specific research questions. It was there, it just seemed a little more buried. And so kind of understanding what you wanted readers to take away from it a little earlier and more clearly would be really helpful. You also talk about intersectionality, but use it in a way that maybe isn't the way that like we think of intersectionality based on like identity politics. And so especially in the paper, somewhat in the presentation, but especially in the paper, you spend a lot of time talking about it, but not really describing how it relates to the project that you're trying to do in this paper. The abstract, it's there, and then there's like passing mentions to it in the paper. So I really like to like hear you bring that out more and discuss more of the definition, but also how it applies to how it could help improve get closer to fair housing. And then this is a comment that I'll make for more than one of your projects, and one that I am going to leverage because I know people ask for it, but I don't necessarily think it's a criticism. And that's like, how would this look in other places, right? Like if we moved beyond Boston, could a similar strategy work that the CAC is doing, or is Boston exceptional anyways? I really like the depth of doing state case studies though, because it really allows you to understand the context of situations. So I only say that as like, maybe make some nod to how this might be replicable or understanding, help us understand things in other places, though I wouldn't want to like, I think there's value in case studies. So the next one, Dr. Lewis looks at different approaches to understanding and addressing racism by looking at aversive racism and implicit bias training, and statements towards addressing inequalities in higher education. So I really like that you are situating this conversation of what it means to be aversive racism and actually racist and actually challenge institutions within the context of higher education, where lots of us operate, but a lot of white liberals really are opposed to challenging their own understandings of what it means to be racist. And I think the way that you're doing this could be a way of moving us towards actually confronting it in a productive way, right? Instead of focusing, just challenging people to focus more on just institutions, but more than just individuals, but on institutions. On that point though, you mentioned a lot how you are using, you're talking about this tension between aversive racism on an institutional level being different than that on the individual level. And I wasn't really clear like why you were being so strong in that, especially in the paper, and if that tension is really as strong as you're suggesting it is, right? So the fact that lots of individuals express aversive racism and then create policies and statements based on that does have implications for the way that the institution and the culture develops. So that it doesn't seem like it's necessarily challenging the fact that there are lots of individuals who are aversively racist and therefore influencing institutions. And if you're not trying to make, it could be also my misunderstanding of the point you're trying to make there. I would love to see this with statements from other places. Some of these policies are still on websites. And if you can say, I think actually this is one of the times where it may be meaningful to say like, this isn't just some like one Midwestern university, lots of us are doing this. And that it's a pervasive problem. It's not unique to one institution, because I can see people saying like, oh, I buy your argument here, but that's not us in this university, that's in a different place, right? And then beyond that, I would love to see this connected back, because you start by talking about how this is a American problem. Let me situate it within a university setting. But then I would love to see you take those findings and go back to the broader American problem. Just kind of a bookends type thing of saying that like this is a case study in the university setting, but one that really reflects larger society as a whole. On Isabelle's paper, so you're addressing the problem or understanding the problem definition and decision-making occurring between residents and elites in the Grant Houses Residents Association in New York City, and addressing this tension between them and Columbia University, which is trying to expand more into the neighborhoods with this narrative and really problematic behavior that's affecting individuals and the people who are living there. I want to kind of second a comment that Dr. Jennings made in the email, which is that like you did a really good job of integrating literatures. And I think that the way you're telling this story is very engaging. And again, really like the idea of focusing on community as a place of really interrogating and resolving these inequalities that exist. The first thing that I'd say in terms of like wanting more clarity or more of a story behind is understanding the role of Columbia, because you start with this residents association meeting, right, where this president is trying to focus on this like youth program where the residents are saying, no, we want you to address infrastructure, right? How does that community meeting relate to Columbia? What was their relationship there? At that point, I think you said in the paper that like Columbia hadn't yet seized controls of that housing community yet. So why did it have influence over the residents association? And more generally, I wanted more of a discussion on whether Columbia was exceptional, if we should expect them to be exceptional, or is this just a like calling out a hypocrite type situation? And if it's that, that's fine, right? But like the New York City police has been condemned for doing same types of things, right? The media, the same types of things. Other universities also doing the same types of things. So what kind of is the takeaway from focusing on Columbia in itself versus these other actors who are also behaving poorly? And then finally, Stephanie's paper or project looking at theorizing gentrification and really understanding the origins of it to understand how we got to where we are, where there's this very class-based focus on gentrification, but a lot of how it's operating is very racialized in ways that affect very racial communities, if I've gotten that synopsis right. So one thing, like there's implicit in your story, this narrative of when we're talking about the values, the way that values change because we're changing populations, implicit in that is this understanding of like power dynamics, right? Or race relations, right? Why are we focusing on class and not race? What are the logical implications of doing that? If you're going to do a theoretical argument, it really be helpful to understand why we're in this pathway where we're focusing on class instead of the one where we would focus more on race, and what the implications of that would be for the types of policies that are resulting from having those different understandings of gentrification. And on that, I want to open it up to Q&A. We'll do that instead of maybe having responses to my comments. Yes, Anthony.
Hello. I had a couple comments. Should I like do it for just one person at a time, or just dump them all at once?
Go ahead and dump it. Just tell us
Dump
all.
it. All right, cool. All right. So for Tim Lucis, so I thought the theory was amazing. Right, the theory was really, really cool. And I buy it 100%. I noticed it in some university settings. that they certainly subscribe to that individualistic model. I wonder though in the methods. Obviously, I haven't seen the working paper, but I would like to see what the methods that you use were, because I'm curious if you were to do a means matching, if you matched universities based on a bunch of different institutional factors, like their budget or their matriculation of African American students or the number of African Americans within the local area, if you could then like incorporate like colleges that do have the individualistic statements versus the ones who are actually trying to move towards equity, and you compared the matriculation of African American professors. I wonder if there's going to be a huge difference. I imagine it is because the theory is so goddamn strong. But I would really like to see that like method used. So for James Jennings, yeah, James. So your theory had like huge ramifications. I just finished up a paper that I'm going to present here actually, where I'm looking at what I'm calling socio-political bifurcation. So it's the connection between segregation, black crime, and the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans. So this problem with actual fair housing, like leading towards more segregation, has huge ramifications on the back end. And if you look at just one of them, is that it leads to disproportionate incarceration of African Americans. I ran a mediation analysis, a bunch of mediation analyses where segregation induced higher levels of black crime, and then black crime induced higher levels of black incarceration. And the arrow pointed the other way as well, where black crime created more segregation, and that led to more incarceration as well. So this breaking the cycle, I couldn't find a way. I tested black representation, more education, and a couple things that you thought would cure it actually made it much, much worse. So I hope you can fix it. I don't know how though, but it sounds like you're on the right track. Isabella, yeah? Is that how you said? Isabelle? All right, Isabelle. So your paper sounds like the distribution of power is extremely important. It reminds me of some stuff that's happening in Sudan, the Congo, Afghanistan, and Niger to a lesser degree. It seems like when people make deals and they don't necessarily have the bargaining power within that bargaining situation, that they lose a lot bad. And so if you wanted to like expand this into a bunch of different cases, you could look internationally and you find a bunch. I don't want to monopolize all the time. If anyone else has questions, I can pause. Nope. All right, cool. So Stephanie, you had a small bit that was extremely powerful. You went right past it. It was like, so the income for quote unquote low income was supposed to be 90,000 or less, which was shocking, and that allowed for rent to be $2,100, which is like that's astounding. And it reminds me of like the extractionism and rent seeking that happened in Russia, and happened actually in a lot of like less developed states. And obviously, it goes back to that distribution of power within different segments of the population, especially in a heterogeneous society where you have this minority population that has traditionally been oppressed. Like they can be extracted. The resources in that community can be extracted. So I don't know if you want to tie it to some of the literature in international relations, but this thing that you're developing, this flag that you're planning, that's gonna be dope. Like I'm really looking forward to seeing that seeing that paper. So yeah, I'm not a theorist, so I can't really comment on the theory itself. But damn, that's gonna be really cool. And I think that's it. I think that's everybody. I think that's everybody. Yep, that's it. I'm done.
Thanks. Are there any other questions, or we can also go to responses from anyone on the panel?
I do have a question. For Isabella's paper, the question that I guess, and I haven't seen the full paper, so I can't really I haven't seen the full paper, so I can't really speak to this. But the question I guess I continuously have is that, is there any literature that speaks to the role of institutions and communities? Is there any literature around around that, because again, I guess what I kept thinking as you were presenting was, well, who says that Columbia has this role, right? Like, because in the way that I was seeing it, in the way you were presenting it, was that this role wasn't just a fiduciary role. This was a moral type of role, by being present, if that makes any sense. And so, is there any literature out there that speaks to that, or just, where does that idea even come from? That a white institution like Columbia is then responsible.
It was a very good question. So there is some literature, like I know there was, what's his name? Marcuse, what was his first name? But he writes about other universities, like University of Pennsylvania, for example, and how because of their expansion, they actually were working pretty closely with the community to, like, they make this promise that they're going to work with the community, and then they actually follow through. Whereas in Columbia's case, it's like they had this opportunity to work with the community, and they just kind of forfeited it. They created a West Harlem Development Corporation, and basically were just completely hands off, despite the fact that their expansion directly affected a lot of residents and displaced residents and businesses. So yeah, that is a tricky thing, like trying not to be too moralistic, but also, analyze it in a way that is fair. But that's definitely something I'll need to look into more.
Yeah, and I guess my follow-up to that is, and the reason I think it's important is because, in a capitalistic society, right, if you're thinking about this again from an international perspective, or just from a capitalism perspective, the institutions of those size, Columbia, Harvard, those are firms, right? Those are economic firms. And so if they're economic firms, what responsibility then do they have, or if they have any at all? And I'm not saying that they don't. I believe that they do. I'm just saying that I feel like that needs to be explored, because again, as Legina pointed out, like they weren't in control of the housing, they weren't there wasn't a fiduciary responsibility until after. So I think that's important to kind of tease out here, and that, this could be groundbreaking work, because I think it makes us re-look at the academy for the capitalist institutions that they are, versus these moralistic institutions that they sometimes are, and most of the time they are not.
Yeah, they will propagate this idea that they're moralistic and helpful when they're really not. Yeah.
Is it possible to even look at how USC is handling it as a contrary, and University of Chicago? Because University of Chicago is definitely dealing with this expansion of the new library as well. But USC has been dealing with this, and part of the reason why USC had is because of crime. Crime was extremely high around USC, and so taking over the community began to decrease, was in hopes of decreasing crime, because there was a part in which enrollment dropped in USC because of the fear of crime.
So on that, we have a minute left, and I've been reminded that we have to end on time despite normal conference conventions, so that other people can transition in. This has been a really great panel. I've really enjoyed hearing and reading about all your projects, and hearing from the audience in the Q&A. And on that, just congratulations on everyone for your presentations.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Take care.
Bye.